The year was 1979. The world was frozen in a stalemate of nuclear tension, a silent war fought with shadows, signals, and secrets. But while the eyes of the public were fixed on the Iron Curtain, something else was watching from the periphery of our atmosphere. Something that did not belong to the East or the West. Something that did not belong to Earth. Deep within the frostbitten expanse of the Alaskan wilderness, at a coordinate known only to a handful of high-ranking officials in the Department of Defense, sat a listening post code named Kingfisher. It was part of the distant early warning line, a system of radar stations designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. But on the night of November 14th, Kingfisher didn't detect a bomber. It detected a ghost. Captain Elias Thorne was the commanding officer on duty that night. A man of cold logic and decades of experience in electronic warfare, Thorne was not prone to flights of fancy. Yet, as he stared at the phosphor-green glow of the radar screen, his blood began to run as cold as the Siberian winds. A blip had appeared near the edge of the Beaufort Sea. It wasn't moving like a plane. It wasn't drifting like a weather balloon. It was stationary at 60,000 feet, defying the laws of aerodynamics in a gale-force storm. Thorne leaned into the console, his voice a low rasp through the intercom. He asked the technician to run a diagnostic, convinced the extreme cold had finally cracked the vacuum tubes. But the diagnostic came back clean. The object was real. It was solid. And then it began to move. In a heartbeat, the blip accelerated from a dead stop to Mach 5, slicing across the screen with a precision that made the radar's refresh rate struggle to keep up. Two F-15 Eagles were scrambled from Galena Air Force Base. Their mission was simple: identify and intercept. The pilots, Major Sarah Viper Vance and Lieutenant David Reed, were the best the Air Force had to offer. They climbed into the blackness of the Arctic night, their afterburners carving twin scars of fire through the clouds. As they leveled off at 40,000 feet, Vance's voice crackled over the secure channel. She reported that she had a visual, but her tone was stripped of its usual professional calm. She described what she saw not as a craft but as a void. A geometric shape, an obsidian octahedron, suspended in the air, glowing with a faint, pulsing violet luminescence. It had no wings, no visible engines, and no exhaust trail. It sat there, mocking the laws of physics, a silent monolith in the sky. When Reed attempted to lock his radar onto the object, his systems went haywire. The cockpit displays flickered and died, replaced by a cascade of strange, rhythmic symbols that resembled no language known to man. Back at Kingfisher, Thorne watched the telemetry data. The F-15s were closing in, but the object remained indifferent. Suddenly, the violet pulse intensified. The radar screen at the base went white, overwhelmed by a massive surge of electromagnetic energy. On the radio, there was only static, a thick, heavy noise that sounded like the crushing depth of the ocean. Then came the scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Major Vance. Her last transmission was a single sentence that would be classified for the next 50 years. "It's not looking at the plane, Elias. It's looking at me." The radar cleared 10 seconds later. The violet light was gone. The obsidian shape was gone. And the two F-15 Eagles had vanished from the sky as if they had never existed. No wreckage was ever found. No parachutes were spotted. The official report stated it was a mid-air collision caused by pilot disorientation during a severe weather event. But Elias Thorne knew better. He had seen the symbols on the backup monitors before they burned out. He had heard the frequency beneath the static, a heartbeat that didn't belong to a human. This was the beginning of Operation Silver Eye, a secret war that would span decades, involving underground bunkers in the Nevada desert, clandestine meetings in the heart of the Kremlin, and a desperate race to reverse engineer a technology that was never meant for human hands. The superpowers of the world realized that they were not the masters of their own house. They were merely the tenants, and the landlord had finally come to collect the rent. In the aftermath of the Kingfisher incident, the United States military didn't just double down on its defenses, it changed the very nature of its intelligence gathering. The focus shifted from tracking Soviet movements to scanning the dead zones of the planet, the places where the fabric of reality seemed thin. They discovered that the Alaskan encounter was not an isolated event. It was a probe, a test of our capabilities, our reactions, and our fear. The files recovered from Thorne's private safe after his mysterious disappearance in 1984 revealed a terrifying pattern. The visitors weren't just observing us from afar. They were integrating. They were using the tension of the Cold War as a smokescreen, a chaotic backdrop against which they could operate without being noticed by the masses. While we were busy building walls on Earth, they were building bridges into our minds. The Silver Eye wasn't just the name of the operation. It was the name given to the first recovered artifact, a spherical device found at the bottom of a crater in the Tunguska region, smuggled out by a joint CIA-KGB defector team. The sphere was made of an alloy that didn't exist on the periodic table. It was warm to the touch, and those who spent too much time near it began to report memory bleeds, vivid recollections of lives they had never lived in places that didn't exist on any map of the stars. The military-industrial complex saw this as the ultimate weapon. If they could harness the power of the Silver Eye, they could control not just the battlefield but the perception of reality itself. They could win the Cold War without firing a single shot. But as the project moved into its second phase, the scientists realized a horrifying truth. The artifact wasn't a weapon. It was a beacon. And the things it was calling were already on their way. Strategic analysts began to notice a strange correlation. Every time a major geopolitical event occurred, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the assassination of world leaders, the secret testing of hydrogen bombs, there was a spike in unidentified aerial phenomena nearby. It was as if our world was a theater and the audience was getting restless. They weren't just watching, they were directing. Thorne's notes mentioned a group known only as the Sentinels, a shadow government that existed above the presidency and the Politburo. This group was comprised of individuals who had made a pact with the visitors. They traded human autonomy for technological scraps, hoping to be the last ones eaten by the wolf. They were the ones who designed the cover stories, the swamp gas and weather balloon explanations that kept the public in a state of blissful ignorance. But the ignorance was starting to crack. By the early 1980s, the frequency of encounters had tripled. Pilots were seeing things they couldn't explain, and radar operators were losing their minds. The secret could no longer be contained by simple propaganda. It needed a more sophisticated approach. It needed a way to blend the alien presence into the fabric of military strategy so thoroughly that the two would become indistinguishable. This led to the creation of the Groom Lake testing facilities, better known to the world as Area 51. But the public's obsession with little green men was exactly what the Sentinels wanted. While the conspiracy theorists looked for crashed saucers, the real work was happening in the black rooms. Labs where human DNA was being mapped against the exotic sequences found in the Silver Eye artifact. They weren't just trying to build better planes, they were trying to build a better human. A human that could survive the coming harvest. As we move deeper into the files of Operation Silver Eye, we find that the Cold War was merely a distraction. A staged conflict designed to keep the world's resources focused on military development, providing a cover for the massive energy requirements of the secret projects. Every dollar spent on a nuclear submarine was a dollar spent on hidden research. Every satellite launched into orbit was another eye in the sky, watching not for Russian missiles, but for the arrival of the fleet. The shadows were growing longer, and the cold was seeping into the bones of the establishment. Major Vance's scream still echoes in the classified corridors of the Pentagon, a reminder that out there, in the vast, unblinking void, there is something that doesn't care about our borders, our ideologies, or our lives. It only cares about the signal. And the signal is getting louder. As the frequency of the pulses from the Silver Eye artifact increased, the leadership of the secret program realized they were no longer in control of the timeline. The year was 1982, and the tension of the Cold War had reached a fever pitch. But behind the closed doors of the black rooms, the enemy wasn't the Soviet Union. The enemy was the silence of the void, and the terrifying revelations coming from the Siberian artifact. The research team, led by a reclusive physicist named Dr. Eris Thorne, Elias Thorne's estranged brother, discovered that the Silver Eye was not just a beacon, it was a biological interface. It didn't interact with computers or wires. It interacted with the human nervous system. Those who stood within its proximity began to experience a phenomenon known as the static. They could hear the thoughts of those around them, but more disturbingly, they began to receive downloads, complex mathematical equations and celestial coordinates that their human brains weren't equipped to process. One such download contained the schematics for what would become the most guarded secret of the 20th century, the Kronos drive. On paper, it was a propulsion system capable of folding space-time, allowing for instantaneous travel between 2 points. In reality, it was something far more sinister. It was a bridge. The Sentinels, the shadow group overseeing the operation, ordered the immediate construction of a prototype vessel. They called it the X-99 Valkyrie. To the outside world, the X-99 was just another experimental high-altitude reconnaissance plane, a successor to the State Route 71 Blackbird. But the Valkyrie didn't have a conventional engine. It was built around a core of liquid mercury and the exotic material harvested from the Silver Eye. The first test flight was scheduled for August 1983. The location was a dry lake bed in the heart of the Nevada desert, a place scrubbed from every civilian map. The pilot chosen for the mission was a man with nothing left to lose, Colonel Jack Breaker Malloy. Malloy had been a decorated combat pilot in Vietnam, but he had been retired from public service after a classified encounter over the South China Sea left him with a permanent, haunting obsession with the lights in the sky. As Malloy climbed into the cockpit of the Valkyrie, he didn't see the usual array of dials and switches. The interior was smooth, dark, and organic. There were no pedals, no stick. Instead, there were 2 depressions for his hands, neural interfaces designed to link his consciousness directly to the ship's core. The moment he placed his hands into the slots, the world changed. He didn't just feel the ship, he became the ship. He could feel the atmosphere pressing against the hull, the rotation of the Earth beneath him, and the cold, vast pull of the moon. Dr. Thorne's voice crackled in his mind, not through his headset, but through his very thoughts. "Engage the drive, Jack. Step through the door." Malloy didn't push a button. He simply willed the ship to be elsewhere. In an instant, the Valkyrie vanished from the Nevada desert. There was no sonic boom, no flash of light. It simply ceased to exist in our dimension. For 12 seconds, Malloy was gone. For those watching from the ground, it was a momentary glitch in reality. But for Malloy, those 12 seconds lasted an eternity. He found himself suspended in a place between places, a realm he later described as the Gray. It was a dimension of pure information where time did not flow linearly. He saw the past and the future laid out like a tapestry of light. He saw the rise and fall of civilizations, and he saw the end of the human race. But he wasn't alone in the Gray. There were shapes moving in the mist. Enormous, spindly entities that resembled cathedral spires made of smoke and glass. They were the architects, the beings who had sent the Silver Eye. They didn't speak in words. They spoke in vibrations that threatened to shatter Malloy's mind. They showed him the true purpose of Operation Silver Eye. It wasn't about technological advancement. It was about conditioning. Humans were being prepared. Our wars, our technology, our very biology were being steered toward a specific point in time. We were being cultivated like a crop, and the Valkyrie's drive was the final proof that the harvest was ready. When the Valkyrie reappeared on the dry lake bed, the ship was glowing with a fierce, radioactive heat. The ground beneath it turned to glass. When the recovery teams finally managed to open the cockpit, they found Malloy slumped over the interface. He was alive, but he was changed. His eyes, once blue, had turned a solid, reflective silver. He didn't recognize his wife. He didn't recognize his own name. He only spoke one word over and over again: arrival. The Sentinels immediately moved Malloy to a deep underground facility in the Appalachian Mountains. They needed to know what he had seen. They needed to know if the drive was safe to use again. But Dr. Thorne began to have doubts. He realized that every time they activated the Kronos drive, they weren't just moving through space. They were thinning the veil between our world and the Gray. They were poking holes in the walls of the fortress, and something was starting to leak through. Reports of shadow people began to spike in the towns surrounding the Nevada test site. Citizens reported seeing tall, flickering figures standing in their bedrooms at night, figures that vanished when the lights were turned on. Electronic devices would turn on and off by themselves. The local livestock was found mutilated with surgical precision, their blood drained and their internal organs replaced with strange, crystalline structures. The military's response was a massive disinformation campaign. They blamed the sightings on mass hysteria, secret Soviet psychological operations, and even a new strain of hallucinogenic fungus in the local water supply. But the truth was far more terrifying. The entities from the Gray were using the holes created by the Valkyrie to enter our world. They weren't invaders in the traditional sense. They were parasites of reality. Back at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs were divided. Some saw the Valkyrie as the ultimate deterrent against the Soviets. If they could teleport a nuclear warhead directly into the Kremlin, the Cold War would be over in minutes. Others, those who had seen the footage of Malloy's silver eyes, feared that they had opened a door they could never close. General Marcus Vance, the father of the pilot who had disappeared in Alaska, was the loudest voice of caution. He had spent years investigating his daughter's disappearance, and he knew that the silver eye was a trap. He argued that the aliens weren't giving us technology, they were giving us the tools of our own destruction. "We are building the very gallows they will hang us with," he famously told a closed-session committee. But Vance was silenced. 2 weeks after his speech, he was found dead in his office, officially a victim of a heart attack. His private files, containing his research on the Alaskan incident and the connection to the Valkyrie, vanished. By 1984, Operation Silver Eye had entered its most dangerous phase, the integration. The Sentinels were no longer content with just testing the drive. They wanted to merge the technology with the global communications network. They realized that the vibrations Malloy had experienced in the Gray could be transmitted through television and radio signals. They began building a series of massive antenna arrays across the globe, ostensibly for strategic communications. But the frequencies these towers emitted were calibrated to the same rhythm as the Silver Eye artifact. They were preparing the minds of the entire human population for the arrival. Deep in his underground cell, Jack Malloy sat in total darkness. He didn't need light to see anymore. He could see the ley lines of the Earth, the pulses of the hidden antennas, and the shadows of the architects as they walked through the walls of his prison. He knew that the countdown had begun. The Cold War was about to end, but not with a treaty or a nuclear explosion. It was about to end with a transformation. The stars were aligning, the veil was tearing, and the Silver Eye was wide open, staring down at a world that had no idea it was about to be reborn in the image of the void. By the mid-1980s, the world felt like it was vibrating. To the average citizen, this was the era of the Walkman, the rise of the personal computer, and the frantic escalation of the space race. But for those embedded within Operation Silver Eye, the vibration was literal. A low-frequency hum had begun to permeate the atmosphere, a sound that could only be picked up by specialized sensors, and by those whose neural pathways had been altered by the Silver Eye artifact. In 1985, Dr. Eris Thorne made a discovery that paralyzed the inner circle of the Sentinels. He had been monitoring the memory bleeds of the staff at the Nevada facility. It wasn't just Jack Malloy anymore. Everyone from the janitors to the top-tier physicists was beginning to remember things that hadn't happened yet. They were dreaming of cities made of translucent glass, of oceans that flowed upward into a black sky, and of a massive, silent fleet descending through the clouds of every major capital on Earth. Thorne realized that the Silver Eye wasn't just a beacon or a drive. It was a reality anchor. By bringing it to Earth, the superpowers had inadvertently anchored our dimension to the Gray. The two worlds were slowly merging. This explained the shadow people and the increasing physical instability of the testing sites. Objects were clipping through floors. Sounds from the 1940s were echoing in 1980s hallways. The fabric of time was fraying. The Sentinels, however, saw this instability as an opportunity. They initiated Project Chimera. If the world was merging with the dimension of the architects, they wouldn't just build ships, they would build soldiers. At a hidden facility beneath the ice of Greenland, the military began the first human-alien hybridization experiments. They used the genetic data harvested from the memory bleeds and the biological residues found in the Valkyrie's cockpit. The goal was to create a new class of officer, the Seers. These individuals would be able to navigate the coming world, possessing the ability to perceive both our physical reality and the information-rich landscape of the Gray. The first successful subject was a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Marcus Thorne, the son of the missing Elias Thorne. He didn't know his family's history with the project. He had been recruited for his high neurological plasticity. After 6 months of exposure to the Silver Eye's radiation and a series of experimental gene therapies, Marcus changed. He didn't get silver eyes like Malloy. Instead, his pupils became elongated, like those of a predator, and his skin took on a faint metallic sheen under certain light. He could see the hidden antennas the government had built. He could see the frequencies they emitted, glowing like neon ribbons in the air. More importantly, he could see the architects. They were everywhere now. They stood in the corners of briefing rooms, watching the generals map out nuclear strategies. They sat in the back of limousines as politicians signed treaties. They didn't interfere, they simply observed like scientists watching a petri dish. Marcus realized that the Cold War wasn't just a distraction for the public, it was a source of energy for the architects. They fed on the collective fear and tension of 4 billion people. Our anxiety was their fuel. While Project Chimera progressed, the Soviet Union was collapsing, not just under the weight of economic pressure, but because their own version of the Silver Eye research had gone horribly wrong. In 1986, a facility near Chernobyl was the site of a secret experiment involving a second recovered artifact, code-named the Black Sun. The official history says a nuclear reactor melted down. The classified history tells a different story. The Soviets had tried to force the Black Sun to generate power, but the artifact reacted violently to the crude human technology. It didn't just explode, it tore a permanent hole into the gray. The meltdown was a desperate attempt to use radiation to cauterize the rift. The concrete sarcophagus built over the reactor wasn't just to keep radiation in, it was to keep something from coming out. Marcus Thorne was sent to Chernobyl as part of a disguised international inspection team. Standing near the ruins of Reactor 4, he saw the truth through his predator eyes. The rift was still there. It looked like a jagged tear in the sky, leaking a thick, oily darkness that the Geiger counters read as lethal radiation. But it wasn't radiation, it was anti-information. It was a void that erased everything it touched. He also saw the architects clustered around the rift. They weren't observing this time, they were harvesting. They were pulling something out of the tear, long, glowing filaments of human consciousness that had been caught in the blast. To the architects, the Chernobyl disaster was a feast. When Marcus returned to the United States, he tried to warn his superiors. He told them that the architects weren't allies, and they weren't just indifferent observers. They were cosmic scavengers who engineered catastrophes to trigger energy harvests. The Silver Eye, the Valkyrie, the Kronos Drive, they were all gifts designed to lead humanity toward a global-scale disaster. But the Sentinels didn't want to hear it. They were addicted to the power the technology gave them. They were already planning the next phase, Operation Blue Harvest. This was the plan to use the global antenna network to trigger a worldwide event, a fake alien invasion that would unite the world under a single Sentinel-controlled government, all while providing the architects with the greatest energy harvest in history. Marcus knew he couldn't stop them from within. He remembered his father's final notes, which spoke of a third path. There was a group of rebels, former scientists and soldiers who had gone underground, dedicated to destroying the artifacts and sealing the rifts. They called themselves the Luddites of the Void. As Marcus planned his escape from the Greenland facility, he was visited in his cell by Jack Malloy. Malloy hadn't aged a day since 1983. His silver eyes were bright, reflecting a world that didn't exist yet. "The harvest is coming, Marcus," Malloy whispered, his voice sounding like 1,000 people speaking at once. But they forgot one thing. A crop can choose to rot. A crop can choose to burn the field. Malloy handed Marcus a small, pulsing object, a fragment of the original Silver Eye that had been inverted through a process Dr. Thorne had died to perfect. It didn't emit a signal, it absorbed it. It was a silence maker. "Go to the Nevada site," Malloy said. "The Valkyrie is still there. It's not a ship anymore. It's a key. If you can fly it into the heart of the original artifact, you won't just destroy the project. You'll collapse the bridge. You'll trap the architects on their side of the door." But the price was high. Collapsing the bridge would mean erasing every piece of technology derived from the Silver Eye. It would mean a total global blackout. It would mean the end of the modern age and the beginning of a new, dark era for humanity. Marcus looked at the silence maker in his hand. He looked at the elongated shadows of the architects stretching across the floor. He knew what he had to do. The Cold War was over, and the real war for the soul of the planet was about to begin in the desert where it all started. He stepped out of his cell, the metallic sheen of his skin glowing in the dim emergency lights. Outside, the Arctic wind howled, but Marcus didn't feel the cold. He only felt the vibration of the earth, and for the first time in years, he started to hum along with it. A counter-frequency, a song of defiance against the stars. The escape from the Greenland facility was not a pursuit of speed, but a dance through dimensions. Marcus Thorne moved through the corridors like a flicker in a film reel, appearing and disappearing as he bypassed the security teams. His seer abilities allowed him to see the thermal signatures of the guards through walls, but more importantly, he could see the lattice, the invisible network of energy that connected the facility to the architect's realm. He didn't just walk, he stepped through the weak points in reality. By the time he reached the surface, the sun was a pale, frozen disk on the horizon. A black, unmarked transport VTOL awaited him, piloted by a member of the Luddites of the Void, a former CIA operative who had seen too much in the jungles of Nicaragua to ever trust a government agency again. They flew low over the ice, staying beneath the sweep of the Sentinel-controlled satellites. "The Nevada site has been upgraded," the pilot shouted over the roar of the engines. "It's not just a base anymore, Marcus. It's a focal point. They've moved the Silver Eye into the center of a massive particle accelerator. They call it the Crown of Thorns. They're planning to ignite the signal on the winter solstice." Marcus looked at the Silence Maker fragment in his palm. It felt heavier now, vibrating with an intensity that made his metallic skin itch. If they ignite that signal, it won't just be an arrival. It'll be an override. Every human mind will be synchronized to the frequency of the Gray. We'll be an auxiliary processing unit for their collective intelligence. As they crossed the border into American airspace, the atmosphere changed. The vibration was no longer a subtle hum, it was a physical pressure. People on the ground were already feeling it. Hospital admissions for unexplained neurological distress had tripled. The media called it a new form of mass anxiety brought on by the fear of nuclear escalation, but Marcus saw the truth. The ribbons of neon frequency in the sky were thickening, turning from a glow into a shroud. The approach to the Nevada desert was a gauntlet. The Sentinels had deployed Wraith units, hybridized interceptors that used the same Kronos drive technology as the Valkyrie. These ships didn't fly, they blinked. They would vanish and reappear miles ahead, firing beams of coherent light that didn't burn skin but unraveled the molecular bonds of whatever they hit. Marcus took the controls. He pushed his consciousness into the VTOL systems, forcing the mundane machinery to mimic the folding he had learned from Malloy's memories. The transport bucked and groaned, its metal frame screaming under the dimensional stress, but they made it. They crashed into the outer perimeter of the Groom Lake facility, the ship skidding across the salt flats in a spray of white dust and sparks. The Crown of Thorns loomed over the desert like a nightmare of industrial geometry. It was a ring of obsidian towers, 3 miles in diameter, surrounding a central spire that pierced the clouds. At the top of that spire sat the Silver Eye, glowing with a violet light so intense it made the very air look like bruised velvet. Marcus emerged from the wreckage, the Silence Maker pulse matching the beat of his own heart. He didn't use a gun. He used the lattice. As the security forces closed in, he reached out and plucked the strings of reality around them. To the guards, it felt like the world had suddenly turned into water. Their weapons became heavy, their footsteps slow, as Marcus moved through them in a blur of silver light. He reached the base of the central spire. There waiting for him was Dr. Eris Thorne. But it wasn't the man he remembered. Eris had been fully integrated. His body was a shell, his skin translucent, revealing a skeletal structure that had been replaced with crystalline filaments. He wasn't a man anymore, he was a biological antenna. "You're late, Marcus," Eris said, his voice echoing from the walls of the spire itself. "The synchronization has already begun. You think you're saving humanity, but you're only trying to preserve a primitive state of being. We are offering you the stars. We are offering you eternity. You're offering us a cage where we forget we're prisoners," Marcus replied, raising the Silence Maker. Eris laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "That fragment is a relic. It was designed to kill a signal. We aren't just sending a signal anymore. We are rewriting the laws of physics. The Silver Eye is no longer a tool. It is the new sun." The ground began to shake. The obsidian towers of the crown began to rotate, creating a massive electromagnetic vortex that sucked the air out of the valley. In the center of the vortex, a rift began to open, larger and more stable than the one at Chernobyl. Through it, Marcus could see the fleet. Millions of geometric shapes, shimmering in the darkness of the gray, waiting for the bridge to solidify. Marcus realized that he couldn't just use the Silence Maker to stop the machine. He had to become the conductor. He remembered Malloy's last words, "A crop can choose to burn the field." He didn't run toward the machine. He ran toward the Valkyrie, which sat in a hangar at the base of the spire. The ship was humming, its liquid mercury core spinning at a frequency that threatened to tear the hangar apart. Marcus threw himself into the cockpit and merged. This time the connection was total. He didn't just feel the ship, he felt the entire crown of thorns. He felt the silver eye at the top of the spire. He felt the architects on the other side of the rift. And he felt the billions of human minds currently being tuned to the frequency. He took the silence maker and crushed it into the neural interface. The effect was instantaneous. A wave of absolute silence erupted from the Valkyrie. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the absence of information. It was a null pulse. As the pulse hit the crown of thorns, the violet light turned a sickening gray. The towers began to crack. The neon ribbons in the sky shattered like frozen glass. Inside the lattice, Marcus saw the architects recoil. For the first time, they felt something they hadn't planned for, a void they couldn't fill. The null pulse began to feed on the energy of the rift itself, using the architect's own power to seal the door. But the energy had to go somewhere. Marcus felt his physical form beginning to dissolve. His metallic skin was peeling away, revealing a core of pure, white light. He was the bridge and he was collapsing. "Father," he whispered into the void, thinking of Elias Thorne, the man who had started this search in the Alaskan snow. "I've closed the door." A massive explosion of white light consumed the Nevada desert. For a brief second, every person on Earth saw a flash of a different world. A world of peace, of silence, of a sky filled with stars that didn't watch back. Then darkness. The global blackout had begun. Every satellite died. Every power grid fried. The modern world ended in a heartbeat. But as the people looked up into the first truly dark sky they had seen in a century, they realized the hum was gone. The pressure in their heads had vanished. They were alone. They were cold. But they were theirs. The global blackout was not merely a loss of electricity, it was a sensory reset for the human race. In the minutes following the null pulse, the world fell into a silence so profound it felt heavy. For the first time since the dawn of the industrial age, the electronic heartbeat of the planet had stopped. No radio waves, no television broadcasts, no humming power lines. In that sudden void, the billions who had been under the architect's subtle influence felt a phantom limb pain in their minds, the abrupt severance of a connection they hadn't known existed. In the Nevada desert, the crown of thorns was no longer a pinnacle of forbidden science. It was a graveyard of twisted obsidian and melted steel. The central spire had collapsed inward, creating a glass-lined crater that smoked with a strange, cold vapor. There was no sign of the Valkyrie. There was no sign of Marcus Thorne. However, the arrival had not been entirely averted. It had been fractured. While the main bridge had collapsed, dozens of smaller rifts had opened momentarily across the globe during the final search. In the forests of Germany, the mountains of Peru, and the suburban outskirts of Tokyo, remnants had been left behind. These were not the architects themselves, but their tools. Drones, biological constructs, and half-formed geometric entities that were now stranded in a world that was no longer being tuned to their frequency. The year 1987 began in a world of candlelight and wood fires. The superpowers, stripped of their high-tech surveillance and instant communication, retreated into a state of paranoid isolation. Without satellites, the military was blind. Without the internet, which was then in its infancy, information moved at the speed of a horse or a steam engine. But within the ruins of the old intelligence agencies, a new group was forming. They called themselves the Torchbearers. Comprised of former Silver Eye researchers, seers who had survived the blackout, and soldiers who had witnessed the Nevada flash, their mission was simple: hunt down the remnants before the governments of the world could find them and try to restart the cycle. Sarah Vance, the pilot who had been presumed dead since the 1979 Alaska incident, was the unlikely leader of this group. She hadn't died in the violet light, she had been displaced. She had spent what felt like years inside the lattice, watching the architects from the shadows. When Marcus collapsed the bridge, the backlash had spat her back into our reality, depositing her in the wreckage of a derelict Soviet listening post in the Ural Mountains. Sarah was different now. Her eyes didn't turn silver and her skin didn't glow. Instead, she had lost the ability to see color. The world to her was a spectrum of grays, but within that gray she could see leaks, traces of anti-information left behind by the stranded alien technology. To her, a remnant looked like a tear in a photograph. By March 1987, The torchbearers had tracked a major remnant to a remote village in the Scottish Highlands. The villagers had stopped communicating with the outside world weeks prior. Travelers who passed nearby reported that the birds had stopped singing and that the sky above the village seemed to stutter, as if the frames of a movie were skipping. When Sarah and her team arrived, they didn't find a massacre. They found a museum of stillness. The villagers were all there, frozen in place. A baker was mid-stride. A child was suspended in the air, having jumped from a porch. They weren't dead, but their personal time had been slowed to a near halt. In the center of the village square sat a shifter, a small, pulsating geometric core that was trying to rebuild a localized version of the bridge. It was feeding on the time energy of the living beings around it to power its distress signal. "It's calling for a rescue," one of the torchbearer technicians whispered, holding a crude vacuum tube-based detector. "If it pulls enough energy, it could reopen a small window. Just enough for one of the fleet's scavengers to slip through." Sarah stepped toward the shifter. She could see the gray ripples it sent through the air. She realized that the nullpulse hadn't just destroyed technology, it had wounded the very concept of time near these artifacts. "We can't just blow it up," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the unnaturally still air. "If we rupture the core, the stored time will snap back all at once. The villagers won't just wake up, they'll age 80 years in a second. They'll turn to dust before they can even scream." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small lead-lined box. Inside was a piece of the Black Sun artifact, recovered from the Chernobyl sarcophagus. It was the polar opposite of the silver eye, where the eye projected, the sun absorbed. As she approached the shifter, the air became thick, like walking through molasses. Her own heartbeat slowed. She could see the architect's influence lingering in the geometry of the device, a design that felt wrong to the human eye, an architecture of angles that shouldn't exist in a three-dimensional world. She placed the Black Sun fragment against the shifter's core. The reaction was violent. The gray world of her vision was suddenly flooded with a blinding, inverted light. The shifter didn't explode, it imploded, folding into itself until it was nothing more than a microscopic point of infinite density. The stutter in the sky vanished. The village snapped back to life. The child landed on the grass. The baker finished his step. They looked around, confused, unaware that for them, 6 weeks had passed in the blink of an eye. They were safe, but the cost was becoming clear. Every time the torchbearers used an artifact to destroy another, the cold began to spread. The cold was what they called the growing patches of dead reality. Areas where nothing could grow, where light didn't reflect properly, and where humans felt a crushing sense of nihilism. The architects weren't just a physical threat. Their very presence was a conceptual poison. They were an invasive species from a dimension that thrived on the absence of life as we understood it. Back at their hidden headquarters, a decommissioned submarine base in the North Atlantic, Sarah looked at a map of the world. It was covered in red pins. Each pin was a remnant. There were thousands of them. The arrival had been stopped, but the infestation had begun. The superpowers were starting to wake up too. In the darkness of the global blackout, the remnants of the KGB and the CIA were reforming. They weren't interested in the Cold War anymore. They wanted the remnants. They wanted the time cores and the shifters. They saw the cold not as a poison, but as the ultimate weapon. If you could freeze an entire city in time, you didn't need nuclear bombs. "The Sentinels are still out there," Sarah told her team. "They lost their crown, but they didn't lose their ambition. They're moving underground, literally. They're building silos of silence, where they can study the remnants away from our eyes." As the world slowly began to rebuild its power grids, a new shadow was falling. It wasn't the shadow of an alien fleet, but the shadow of a human-alien synthesis that was more dangerous than either alone. The integration that Marcus Thorne had tried to stop was happening anyway, just slower and in the dark. Deep in the Appalachian facility, where Jack Malloy had once been held, a new heart was beating. It wasn't human and it wasn't architect. It was something grown in a vat, fed on the radiation of a captured remnant. The Sentinels called it the second child. And it was starting to dream. As the year 1987 transitioned into 1988, the world began to flicker back to life, but it was a wounded, distorted version of the civilization that had existed before the nullpulse. The global power grids were being restored, but the electricity felt different. Unstable, prone to rhythmic surges that matched the low-frequency hum still echoing in the crust of the earth. This second child, maturing in the lightless depths of the Appalachian silo, was no longer just a biological experiment. It had become a psychic anchor for every surviving piece of alien technology on the planet. Sarah Vance and the torchbearers were now operating as ghosts. With the return of government surveillance, their mission had become twice as dangerous. They weren't just hunting alien remnants. They were being hunted by the Black Ops units of a resurrected Sentinel network. These units, now calling themselves the Directorship, had traded their military uniforms for the sterile white lab coats of a new, terrifying science. In July 1988, a distress signal reached the torchbearers from an unexpected source. A rogue Soviet scientist named Dr. Volkov, who had been part of the original Black Sun project at Chernobyl. He was hiding in an abandoned salt mine near Krakow, Poland. His message was short and terrified: "The second child has opened its eyes." The harvest did not fail. It was simply delayed. Sarah led a small strike team into the salt mine. The descent was harrowing. The walls of the mine were covered in a crystalline frost that glowed with a faint, pulsing violet light, the signature of the Silver Eye. As they moved deeper, the air grew unnaturally cold, and the team began to experience echo visions. They saw themselves as they were years ago, and as they might be decades from now, their timelines blurring in the presence of a massive time core being cultivated by the Directorship. In the heart of the mine, they found Dr. Volkov. He was fused to a chair, his nervous system literally wired into a series of glass vats. In the center of the room was a suspended entity, the second child. It was a pale, translucent humanoid, but its limbs were too long, and its face was a smooth, featureless surface of reflective silver. Around it, the Directorship had constructed a neural loom, a device designed to weave the second child's thoughts into the global telecommunications network that was currently being rebuilt. "You don't understand," Volkov whispered, his eyes rolling back in his head. "The architects didn't want to invade. They wanted to incarnate. They couldn't survive in our atmosphere, so they are building a vessel that can. The second child is the first of a new race, a bridge made of flesh." The second child turned its featureless head toward Sarah. Even without eyes, she felt its gaze. It wasn't a look of hostility, but of a terrifying, cold hunger. It began to broadcast. Every radio, every television, and every telephone that had been restored across Europe suddenly emitted a single, piercing tone. People in their homes clutched their heads as the conditioning resumed. But this time, it wasn't a subtle vibration. It was a command. The second child was calling the remnants to it. Across the continent, the stranded alien drones and geometric shifters began to move. They tore through military hangars and research labs, converging on the location of the salt mine. The Directorship had planned this. They wanted to centralize all the alien technology into a single, unstoppable force, with the second child as the hive mind. "We have to sever the loom," Sarah shouted over the rising hum. She deployed the silence maker fragment, but the second child anticipated the move. It raised a hand, and the laws of physics in the room simply buckled. The torchbearers' weapons became as light as feathers, then as heavy as lead. Gravity reversed, pinning the team to the ceiling. The second child was manipulating the lattice, with a precision that even Marcus Thorne hadn't achieved. However, the second child had a weakness it didn't yet understand. It was part human. Sarah, pinned against the salt-encrusted ceiling, reached into her own mind. She didn't fight the psychic pressure, she leaned into it. She used her seer abilities to find the human DNA within the creature, the echoes of the kidnapped children and the memory bleeds that had been used to create it. She began to project her own memories of the Alaska flight, the cold wind, the smell of jet fuel, and the raw, unadulterated fear of that night. She flooded the creature with human emotion. The second child recoiled. To an entity built on the cold logic of the architects, the chaotic, burning intensity of human grief and fear was like acid. The loom began to spark. The violet light flickered and turned a muddy, bruised purple. The gravity snapped back, dropping the torchbearers to the floor. "Now!" Sarah yelled. One of the team members, a former demolition expert, slid a specialized anti-information charge into the base of the neural loom. The explosion didn't produce fire. It produced a sphere of absolute darkness that consumed the loom and the glass vats in a silent, implosive rush. The second child let out a psychic shriek that was heard by every living soul within 100 miles. The featureless silver face cracked, revealing a void beneath. Then it vanished, not by dying but by phasing out of our dimension. It was gone, but the salt mine was left as a cold zone. Dr. Volkov died as the connection was severed, but his final look was one of peace. The conditioning tone across Europe stopped. The remnants that had been rushing toward Poland fell silent, becoming inert heaps of alien metal once again. The torchbearers escaped the mine just as the Polish military, controlled by the directorship, arrived to secure the site. As they watched the salt mine collapse from a distance, Sarah felt a new sensation. The cold wasn't just in the environment anymore. She could feel it in the back of her own mind. The second child had been defeated, but its broadcast had achieved one goal. It had mapped the neural network of the entire European population. The directorship now had the source code for the human mind. They didn't need a central spire or a giant artifact anymore. They had the frequency. They're going to try it again, the technician said, shivering despite the summer heat. But they won't use a monster in a salt mine next time. They'll use the satellites. They're launching the Starlink project next year. Sarah looked up at the darkening sky. The stars were beautiful, but to her they now looked like a grid, a cage waiting to be locked. The Cold War was transitioning into a silent war, where the battlefield was no longer territory, but the very essence of human consciousness. "We need to find Marcus," Sarah said quietly. "He's the only one who knows how to break the frequency permanently. He's not dead. He's just waiting in the gray." As they drove away into the night, the radio in their Jeep crackled. For a second, a voice came through the static. It was distorted, layered with the voices of 1,000 others, but Sarah recognized it instantly. "The harvest is inevitable," the voice whispered. "The fruit is ripe." The second child was only the first of many. The war for the soul of the earth had just entered its most deceptive phase. The directorship was no longer just an agency. It was becoming a religion of the void, and the world was beginning to pray. By the autumn of 1988, the surface of the world appeared to be returning to a state of fragile normalcy. The Great Blackout was being rewritten in history books as a massive solar flare event, a convenient celestial scapegoat for the collapse of the global infrastructure. But beneath this veneer of recovery, the directorship was weaving a new web. They had abandoned the brute force of the crown of thorns for something far more elegant and insidious: the Project Overlook satellite network. Sarah Vance and the remaining torchbearers had retreated to a hidden bunker beneath the granite of the Swiss Alps. They were working against time, their numbers dwindling as the directorship's purge units, augmented humans with neural dampeners, hunted them across every continent. Sarah's condition was worsening. The cold she had felt in the salt mine was spreading through her nervous system, turning her veins a faint, metallic silver. She was becoming a living receiver, hearing the whispers of the architects even in her sleep. In October, Sarah received a cryptic transmission. It wasn't a radio signal, but a rhythmic pulse in her own mind, a sequence of coordinates that led to a decommissioned naval yard in Murmansk, Russia. The pulse carried the signature of the Valkyrie drive, a frequency she hadn't felt since the Nevada explosion. "It's Marcus," she told her team. "He's trying to punch through from the gray. He's not just waiting, he's trapped in a loop." The mission to Murmansk was a desperate gamble. The team had to smuggle themselves into the heart of a Soviet military zone that was now secretly under the control of the directorship's eastern branch. When they arrived, they didn't find a ship or a soldier. They found a bleed zone. In the center of a rusted submarine dry dock, reality was behaving like a liquid. The air shimmered with the heat of 1,000 invisible suns, and the shadows on the walls moved independently of the objects that cast them. At the center of this distortion sat a spherical object, a face pod, that had seemingly grown out of the concrete floor. As Sarah approached the pod, the cold in her mind flared into a burning heat. She placed her hand on the surface, and the pod split open, releasing a cloud of the same violet vapor that had haunted the Alaska incident. Inside lay Marcus Thorne, or what remained of him. He was encased in a crystalline lattice, his body suspended in a state of permanent molecular flux. He looked like a man made of frozen lightning. His eyes snapped open. They weren't predator eyes anymore, nor were they silver. They were voids, containing the swirling nebulae of a distant galaxy. "Sarah?" He spoke, but his mouth didn't move. The voice resonated directly in the iron of the dry dock. "The satellites, you must stop the launch. They aren't just for communication. They are a lens. Marcus explained the directorship's final play. The Overlook satellites were equipped with mirrors made of the same synthetic alloy as the Silver Eye. When the sun reached a specific angle during the winter solstice, the satellites would reflect the solar wind through these mirrors, focusing a massive beam of tuned energy onto the Earth's ionosphere. This wouldn't kill the population, it would standardize them. It would erase the individual ego, turning the human race into a single, massive neural processor for the architects. "I can't leave this place," Marcus's voice echoed with a profound sadness. "I am the anchor for this rift. If I move, the gray will swallow this entire coast. But I can give you the key." Marcus reached out a trembling, crystalline hand. From his palm, a small, obsidian octahedron drifted towards Sarah. It was a null core, a concentrated piece of the void that could collapse any tuned frequency within its radius. "You have to get this to the launch facility in French Guiana," Marcus warned. "The directorship is using the European Space Agency as a front. The countdown has already begun. If those satellites reach orbit, the door will stay open forever." Before Sarah could respond, the dry dock was illuminated by the harsh glare of searchlights. The directorship had found them. A fleet of Wraith gunships descended from the clouds, their hulls shimmering with the same phase technology as the Valkyrie. The purge units, clad in pressurized suits that made them look like faceless deep-sea divers, swarmed the perimeter. "Go," Marcus commanded. As the team retreated toward their transport, Marcus began to glow with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't fighting with guns or blades. He was expanding his own bleed zone. As the purge units entered the dry dock, they began to glitch. Their movements became erratic, their bodies stretching and compressing as Marcus manipulated the local gravity. The air ignited as the nitrogen in the atmosphere began to fuse under the pressure of his will. Sarah watched from the hatch of their plane as the entire naval yard was consumed in a brilliant violet dome of energy. Marcus was sacrificing his remaining humanity to buy them a few hours of silence. The journey to South America was a race against a global net that was rapidly tightening. The directorship had declared the torchbearers international terrorists and carriers of a new viral strain. Every airport, every port, and every border crossing was equipped with neural scanners designed to detect the silver vein mutation. Sarah's team was forced to use the shadow paths, the ley lines that Marcus had mapped before his transition. These were the hidden channels of energy that the architects used to move through the world. Traveling these paths was a nightmare. The team saw visions of the harvested Earth, a world where humans lived in hive-like structures, their minds stripped of memory and emotion, serving as biological batteries for the fleet. By the time they reached the jungles of French Guiana, Sarah could barely stand. The null core was absorbing her own life force, feeding on her memories to maintain its stability. She was forgetting her childhood, forgetting the face of her father, forgetting the feeling of the wind on her face during that first flight in Alaska. "The cost of success," she whispered to herself, remembering a phrase from the old files. "The cost of success is the self." They stood on a ridge overlooking the Kourou Space Center. On the launch pad sat the Ariane 4 rocket, its nose cone housing the first cluster of the Overlook satellites. The countdown was at T-4 hours. The jungle around the facility was silent. The birds and animals had long since fled the cold that the mirrors were already beginning to emit. "We don't have enough firepower to take the base," the technician noted, looking at the hundreds of guards and the automated turret systems. "We don't need to take the base," Sarah replied, her voice now sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. "We just need to get the core to the fueling lines. When that rocket ignites, the core will travel up the plume. It will turn the launch into a null event." But Sarah knew something she hadn't told the team. The core needed a biological trigger. It needed a conscious mind to navigate the explosion, to ensure the null pulse reached the satellites and not just the ground. She looked at the obsidian octahedron in her hand. It was beautiful and terrifying, a piece of the dark that promised an end to the light. She realized that she had been being prepared for this since 1979. Her abduction, her return, her silver eyes, it was all a sequence of events leading to this single moment of defiance. "I'm going in alone," she said. The team protested, but the air around Sarah was already starting to vibrate with a frequency that pushed them back. She wasn't a pilot anymore. She wasn't a soldier. She was a weapon, and the target was the future of the human soul. As she began her descent toward the launch pad, the sky above French Guiana began to turn that familiar, bruised purple. The architects were watching. The fleet was waiting just beyond the veil. And in the center of the jungle, a single silver-veined woman was carrying the weight of a silent world in her hands. The descent into the Kourou Space Center was like walking through a dream where every step felt as if it were being taken underwater. The air around the launch pad was thick with the cold, a localized suppression of entropy that made the jungle's humidity feel like freezing fog. Sarah Vance moved through the high-security perimeter not by stealth, but by being a ghost in the machine. Every camera that turned its lens toward her glitched into a static hiss. Every guard who looked in her direction felt a sudden, crushing migraine that forced their eyes to the ground. The directorship had prepared for many things: sabotage, aerial bombardment, even a nuclear strike. AMA they had not prepared for a woman who was no longer entirely anchored to the physical world. As she reached the base of the Ariane 4 rocket, the null core in her hands began to pulse in synchronicity with the countdown. T-minus 60 minutes. The rocket loomed above her, a white spear aimed at the throat of the heavens. Inside its fairing sat the overlook mirrors, the instruments that would soon turn the sun's life-giving light into a frequency of total control. "Sarah, stop." The voice didn't come from the intercom. It came from the shadows beneath the gantry. Stepping into the dim light was a man she hadn't seen in years, yet his face was burned into her memory: General Marcus Vance, her father. For a moment, the silver in her veins stilled. But as he stepped closer, she saw the truth. This wasn't the man who had fought for her disappearance. His eyes were wide and vacant, his skull fitted with a series of neural ports that hummed with a faint blue light. He was a puppet, a high-level biological interface used by the architects to communicate when the directorship's scientists weren't enough. "The mirrors are not for your destruction, daughter," the general said, his voice a mechanical hollow of the father she remembered. "They are for your peace. Humanity is a chaotic, self-destructive signal. We are the filter. We are the harmony that will end your wars and your suffering. At the cost of our souls, Dad?" Sarah's voice cracked, the sound of grinding metal softening for a heartbeat. "The soul is an inefficiency," he replied, stepping forward to block her path to the fueling lines. "Join the signal. Let the overlook wash away the pain of 1979. We can be together in the gray where time does not erode." Sarah looked at the man who had once been her hero, now reduced to a relay station for an interdimensional parasite. She realized that the architects didn't just want our labor or our energy, they wanted our history. They wanted to consume the very essence of human experience and replace it with a static, eternal now. "I'd rather die in the wind of Alaska than live forever in your silence," she whispered. She raised the null core. The general lunged at her with a speed that was physically impossible for a man of his age, his movements driven by the architect's puppet strings. But Sarah didn't fight back with force. She opened her mind. She let the cold within her flood outward, not as a weapon but as a memory. She projected the feeling of the cockpit, the smell of her father's old flight jacket, and the raw human love that had once defined them. The general froze. The neural ports in his skull began to spark as the architect's cold logic collided with a surge of authentic human emotion. For a fleeting second, the vacancy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of agonizing recognition. "Run, Sarah," he gasped, the blue light in his ports turning a violent red. "Break the lens." A surge of feedback erupted from his implants, throwing Sarah back against the gantry. The general collapsed, his body finally free of the architect's control, but at the cost of his life. T-minus 10 minutes. The alarms at the base began to wail. The directorship had realized the breach. Wraith units were converging on the launch pad, and the automated turrets began to fire blindly into the fog. Sarah scrambled toward the liquid oxygen fueling lines. Her vision was failing. The null core was now drawing so much from her that her surroundings were dissolving into geometric patterns of light and shadow. She reached the primary fuel valve and pressed the obsidian octahedron against the frosted metal. The core didn't just sit there, it began to fuse with the rocket's skin, its dark surface spreading like a virus. "This is for the silence," she said, her hands trembling as the silver veins on her arms began to glow with a blinding white light. The rocket's engines ignited. A deafening roar filled the jungle, a pillar of fire that lit up the night for hundreds of miles. As the Ariane 4 began its slow, heavy climb into the sky, the null core traveled with it. Sarah stayed on the gantry, her body caught in the backwash of the heat, her consciousness tethered to the rising rocket. As the vehicle cleared the atmosphere, the core reached its saturation point. It didn't explode in the traditional sense. It released a conceptual vacuum. High in the thermosphere, as the fairing fell away to reveal the overlook mirrors, the null pulse hit. The mirrors didn't break, they simply ceased to reflect. The synthetic alloy was stripped of its properties, turning into useless, inert glass. The standardization beam that was meant to ignite with the solstice sun was smothered before it could ever form. The pulse traveled back down the telemetry links, surging into the directorship's computers, their satellites, and their neural networks. Across the globe, the puppet officers and the purge units fell to their primeval knees as the frequency that sustained them was erased. But the backlash was total. On the gantry in French Guiana, Sarah Vance felt the world slip away. She wasn't dying, she was being unwritten. The null core had performed its task, but in doing so, it had used her as the final piece of the circuit. She felt herself becoming a part of the wind, a part of the stars, a part of the very silence she had fought to protect. The rocket, now a hollow shell of dead technology, tumbled back toward the Earth, burning up in the atmosphere like a falling star. To the observers below, it was a failed launch. To the architects in the gray, it was a slammed door. The global net was broken. The overlook was blind. Humanity had bought itself more time, but the cost was the loss of its greatest protectors. Marcus was an anchor in Russia, and Sarah was now a ghost in the wind. The year 1988 ended with the darkest winter solstice in history. There was no arrival. There was no standardization. There was only the cold, hard reality of a world that had to learn to live without the cold. But deep in the black rooms of the Pentagon and the Kremlin, the survivors of the directorship were already looking at the empty spaces in the sky. They knew that the architects were patient. They knew that a door once opened is never truly locked. And they knew that the second child was still out there, somewhere in the gray, waiting for a new mother. The silent war had not ended. It had simply gone deeper into the shadows. The midnight sky over the Nevada desert was split open not by thunder, but by the silent arrival of an unmarked heavy-lift cargo plane. As its wheels touched the secret tarmac of Sector 7, the most dangerous smuggling operation in human history reached its destination. The cosmic embryo, the pulsating metal sphere stolen from the deepest sublevels of a collapsing Soviet bunker, was now on American soil. But the victory felt hollow. When the cargo bay doors hissed open, the recovery team found half the security detail in a state of catatonic shock, while the rest stared blankly into the void, their minds seemingly erased. The sphere wasn't just emitting radiation, it was broadcasting a psychic frequency that dismantled the human ego. As the embryo was lowered into a lead-lined subterranean laboratory, military strategists at the Pentagon gathered behind closed doors to rewrite the book on global defense. The Cold War had officially mutated. It was no longer a game of nuclear brinkmanship or territorial influence. It was a race to control a biological god. Intelligence reports suggested that the fragments remaining in Moscow had begun to resonate in synchrony with the one in Nevada. The Iron Curtain was no longer made of steel, but of a telepathic veil that threatened to merge the collective consciousness of the East and West into something alien, something hive-minded. Inside the lab, the symbols etched into the embryo's surface began to glow with a sickly, rhythmic violet light. Scientists discovered that the entity inside was feeding, not on electricity or heat, but on the radio waves and information networks surrounding the base. American radar systems across the West Coast began to glitch, displaying ghost fleets and phantom bombers that didn't exist. Radio transmissions were replaced by a metallic, rhythmic weeping. General Vance, watching through a reinforced observation window, realized with a sinking heart that the sphere wasn't a weapon they had captured. It was a beacon they had invited into their home. It was lighting a path through the dark for a watcher fleet that had been waiting for eons. In a desperate bid to contain the leak, the military initiated the White Noise Protocol. Massive frequency jammers were erected around the desert perimeter to drown out the embryo's call. However, the interference created a nightmare scenario. The soldiers stationed at the base began to experience temporal bleeding. They remembered the memories of the people the embryo had encountered in Russia. They spoke in forgotten dialects and wept for families they never had. The sphere was using human memory as a library, processing our history and transmitting the data to a dark point in the Boötes void. We were being catalogued. The tension snapped at 3 o'clock hours. A soundless explosion rippled through the facility, a psychic shockwave that shattered glass and burst eardrums. The embryo's outer shell had cracked. What leaked out was neither liquid nor gas, but a sentient shadow that seemed to drink the light from the room. Security cameras flickered, and when the feed returned, the lead researcher was gone. All that remained was his empty lab coat on the floor and a shimmering human-shaped distortion in the air. The entity was no longer contained. It was navigating the facility's ventilation system like a ghost in the machine. Strategic Command escalated the threat to level Omega. If this shadow form reached the surface, it could theoretically interface with the global satellite network, turning every screen and speaker on Earth into a conduit for its influence. General Vance stood over the zero-point failsafe, a button that would detonate a tactical nuclear device beneath the base, vaporizing everything within a 5-mile radius. But as his finger hovered over the glass casing, a voice crackled over the base-wide intercom. It was the voice of Vance's son, who had been missing in action for over a decade. "Don't close the door, Dad," the voice whispered with a chilling metallic resonance. "They aren't here to destroy us. They are here to remember us." The line between strategy and madness had vanished. In the corridors, soldiers began to turn their weapons on one another, unable to distinguish friend from a psychic projection. The embryo was dismantling the hierarchy of command from the inside out. Outside, beneath the shifting sands, the ancient UFO wreckage that had been buried for millennia began to vibrate in sympathy with the cracked sphere. The sleeping giants were waking up, responding to the call of their embryo. The two superpowers of the Cold War, once focused on each other's destruction, were now irrelevant pawns in a cosmic reawakening. As the sun began to rise over Nevada, the sky didn't turn blue. It remained a bruised, electric purple. The stars above seemed to shift, realigning into patterns that defied modern astronomy. The first breach had been successful. The shadow form that had escaped the lab climbed to the highest radio tower of the base, stretching its darkness toward the heavens. It wasn't an invasion of ships and lasers. It was an invasion of the soul. The cord had been severed, and the transmission was complete. The world was no longer ours, and the Watchers were finally answering the call. As the purple haze settled over the Nevada horizon, the world outside Sector 7 remained blissfully unaware that the fundamental laws of reality had just been rewritten. While the public watched grainy news reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena and solar flares, the high-ranking officials within the Pentagon were staring at a terrifying new map. The shadow form that had ascended the radio tower hadn't just broadcast a signal. It had woven itself into the global telecommunications grid. The silent occupation had begun, not with boots on the ground, but with a ghost in the wires. Within hours of the breach, the behavior of the world's most powerful intelligence networks began to shift. The CIA's most advanced computers, the behemoths of the early digital age, started processing data at speeds that defied physics. They weren't just analyzing Soviet troop movements anymore. They were calculating the trajectory of incoming celestial bodies that shouldn't have existed. In Moscow, the KGB reported a similar phenomenon. The rivalry that had defined the 20th century was being forcibly dissolved by a third party, an architect from the stars that viewed human borders as nothing more than lines in the dirt. Inside the ruins of the Nevada facility, General Vance found himself in a waking nightmare. The zero-point failsafe had been disabled, not by a physical hand, but by a software override that seemed to anticipate his every thought. The voice of his son continued to drift through the hallways, a siren song designed to keep him from interfering. But Vance was a man of cold logic. He realized that the shadow form was a neural bridge, a bridge between our crude biological minds and the vast, cold intellect of the Watchers. To the entity, the human race was a biological hard drive, and the harvest had finally commenced. The strategic focus shifted from containment to survival. Elite Black Ops units, specifically trained in sensory deprivation to resist psychic influence, were dispatched to the base. Their mission: to sever the connection between the radio tower and the global grid by any means necessary. These men, known as the Hollow Men, because they had undergone experimental surgery to dampen their emotional centers, were the only ones who could walk through the halls of Sector 7 without succumbing to the hallucinations. They found the base transformed. The walls were sweating a black oily substance, and the air smelled of ozone and ancient dust. As the hollow men descended into the lower levels, they witnessed the true scale of the horror. The soldiers who hadn't been killed in the initial pulse were now physically fused with the facility's machinery. Their nervous systems had been pulled out like copper wiring, integrated into the base's mainframe to provide more processing power for the embryo's signal. It was a fusion of high-tech military hardware and grotesque alien biology, the ultimate expression of the high-tech dark aesthetic the Watchers favored. Success, in the eyes of these entities, had a cost that was paid in human meat and shattered souls. On the global stage, the butterfly effect was in full swing. Small, seemingly insignificant technical glitches in stock markets and power grids were actually the entity's way of terraforming the planet's digital infrastructure. It was preparing Earth to receive a massive influx of data, the collective consciousness of a dying race seeking a new vessel. The military-industrial complex, once the pride of the United States, was being hollowed out from within, turned into a giant antenna for the alien gods. Every top-secret file, every nuclear code, and every hidden project was being uploaded into the void. Deep in the heart of the Kremlin, a mirror image of this tragedy was unfolding. The Soviet leaders, realizing they had lost control of their own cosmic research, sent a desperate, encoded message to Washington. For the first time in history, the two superpowers agreed on a joint military strike against their own research facilities. It was a scorched earth policy on a planetary scale. If they couldn't own the future, they would ensure there was no future to be owned. But the Watchers were always one step ahead. The message was intercepted and rewritten mid-flight, turning the call for cooperation into a declaration of total war. As the hollow men reached the central chamber, they saw the shadow form standing before the cracked embryo. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was a doorway. Through its translucent body, they could see a different sky. A sky filled with massive, monolithic ships that looked like shards of obsidian. The ships were moving and they were close. The countdown to the great arrival had reached its final seconds. General Vance, watching from a hidden terminal, saw the truth. The Cold War was never about capitalism versus communism. It was a controlled experiment to see which ideology could build a better transmitter for the invaders. The episode ends with the first of the obsidian shards breaking the Earth's atmosphere over the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't fire lasers, they didn't drop bombs. They simply hovered and the world went silent. Every television, every radio, and every telephone on the planet emitted a single low-frequency hum. The silent occupation was over. The active reign had begun. The humans were no longer the players at the table. They were the pieces being moved across a board they couldn't even see. The obsidian shards hanging over the world's oceans were not ships in any sense that human engineers understood. They did not displace air, they displaced reality. As these monolithic structures hovered motionless, the global silent occupation transitioned into a terrifying phase of physical restructuring. In the war rooms of the Pentagon and the bunkers of the Kremlin, the most powerful men on Earth realized they weren't facing an invading army, but a cosmic maintenance crew. To the Watchers, humanity was a chaotic glitch in a planetary system they had seeded eons ago, and the time had come to debug the world. The hollow men, inside Sector 7, were the first to witness the terraforming process. The black, oily substance sweating from the walls began to harden into a crystalline lattice, turning the underground base into a geometric cathedral of cold, dark light. General Vance, still clinging to his terminal, watched as the cost of success was finally calculated. The alien intelligence wasn't interested in our gold, our oil, or our land. They were interested in the neurokinetic energy generated by decades of human conflict. The Cold War, with all its fear, strategy, and technological breakthroughs, had been a giant battery-charging exercise. Every secret file and every military advancement had served only to refine the frequency of human suffering to a point where it could sustain the Watchers' arrival. Outside, the butterfly effect reached its catastrophic peak. The subtle glitches in the global power grid suddenly synchronized. Across the globe, city lights began to pulse in the same rhythmic violet hue that had emanated from the embryo. In New York, London, and Tokyo, people stood in the streets, paralyzed by a high-decibel transmission that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the prefrontal cortex. It wasn't a message, it was a format command. The Watchers were rewriting the human brain's operating system, erasing individual identity to prepare the population for the hive integration. In a final, desperate act of defiance, the remaining joint forces of the US and the Soviet Union launched Project Kronos. This was the ultimate alternative history contingency, a weaponized particle accelerator designed to create a localized temporal loop. The goal was to trap the obsidian shards in a pocket of frozen time, effectively pausing the invasion before the format command was complete. But as the countdown for Kronos began, the shadow form in Sector 7, the one wearing the voice of Vance's son, spoke one last time. "You cannot use time as a shield against those who built the clock," it whispered. The activation of Project Kronos did not stop the ships. Instead, it tore a hole in the fabric of the 20th century. For a brief, hallucinatory moment, the comparative history of Earth was visible to everyone. People saw versions of the world where the Cold War had turned hot in 1962, versions where the embryo was never found, and versions where humanity had already been extinct for centuries. The Watchers fed on these alternate timelines, sucking the potential energy out of human choice. The high-tech aesthetic of the alien ships intensified, glowing with the stolen light of a billion what-ifs. By the time the temporal ripples settled, the military-industrial complex had collapsed. There were no more generals, no more presidents, and no more spies. There were only the processed, billions of humans standing in perfect, silent rows, their eyes glowing with a faint violet light, their minds linked into a singular planetary network. The micro-niche details of human life, the small objects, the personal trinkets, the individual memories, were being systematically discarded. In the shadow of the obsidian shards, a pile of unnecessary human artifacts grew. Watches, wedding rings, and dog tags, piled high like the husks of a spent civilization. General Vance, the last man in Sector 7 whose mind remained his own, looked at the monitor. He saw the shadow form merge with the embryo's core, forming a perfect dark sphere of absolute silence. The Great Harvest was nearly complete. The Watchers hadn't come to rule us. They had come to harvest the success of our evolution and leave the empty shell behind. The Earth was being turned into a giant, automated data storage facility, a cold, high-tech tomb for the memories of a race that had thought it was the center of the universe. As the 11th hour drew to a close, the obsidian shards began to hum. The vibration was so intense that it turned the desert sands of Nevada into glass. The active rain was moving toward its final objective, the total synchronization of Earth with the dark network of the Boötes void. There was only one piece of the puzzle left, the final transmission that would lock the planet into its new eternal orbit. The world held its breath, a billion souls waiting for the final command that would extinguish the last spark of human independence. The singularity of shadows. The atmosphere of Earth had become a conductor. The purple sky was no longer a gas, it was a liquid crystal display, reflecting the cold, geometric thoughts of the Watchers. The obsidian shards, now pulsing with the rhythmic heartbeat of a billion synchronized human minds, began their final descent toward the planet's major ley lines. This was the Great Synchronization, the moment where biological life and alien computation merged into a single terrifying entity. The cost of success was finally paid in full. Humanity had achieved global peace, but only because the concept of the individual had been deleted from the cosmic record. In the depths of Sector 7, General Vance stood as the last ghost in the machine. Surrounded by the crystalline lattice that used to be a high-tech military base, he clutched a small, rusted compass, a micro-niche relic from his father's service in World War II. It was the only object in the room that the Watchers hadn't digitized, a small fragment of analog chaos in a world of digital perfection. He realized that the alien intelligence couldn't process sentiment, they could only process data. The alternative history they had constructed was missing the one thing that made humanity dangerous, the ability to act without logic. Vance looked at the cosmic embryo, now a blinding sun of dark energy at the center of the lab. The shadow form, still wearing the face of his son, hovered before him. "The harvest is complete, Father," the voice echoed, vibrating through the very marrow of his bones. "We have saved you from yourselves. No more war. No more hunger. Only the eternal sequence." But Vance saw the truth in the flickering violet light. The success they offered was the silence of a graveyard. The high-tech aesthetic of the Watchers was merely a beautiful shroud for a dead world. With a final, trembling breath, Vance didn't reach for a weapon or a button. He reached for the compass and smashed it into the heart of the embryo. It was a primitive, illogical act of destruction. The tiny needle, caught in the alien's hyper-advanced energy field, created a butterfly effect of pure randomness. For a split second, the neural bridge faltered. The logic of the Watchers could not calculate the trajectory of a broken, rusted needle guided by grief. The synchronization skipped a beat. That single heartbeat of static was enough. Across the globe, for one glorious and terrifying second, the processed billions woke up. The violet light in their eyes flickered. In that moment of lucidity, the collective human spirit didn't pray or scream, it fought back. The accumulated military strategies of the Cold War, the secret files of 1,000 projects, and the raw survival instinct of 1,000,000 years were weaponized. Not against the ships, but against the network. If humanity was to be a battery, they would overload the circuit. The obsidian shards began to crack. The high-tech surfaces shattered into millions of black glass fragments as the dark network suffered a catastrophic system failure. The Watchers, unable to contain the surge of chaotic human emotion, began to withdraw. They weren't defeated by fire, but by the sheer, unmanageable complexity of the human soul. The ships rose, bleeding violet light, and vanished into the Boötes void as quickly as they had arrived. The sky turned from purple to a bruised, weary gray. The world that remained was not the world that had been. The cities were silent, the technology was fried, and the alternative history of the last few days had left deep scars on the landscape. But the silent occupation was over. People stood in the streets, looking at their hands as if seeing them for the first time. They were broken, they were starving, and they were alone in a vast, cold universe, but they were themselves. The cost of success had been the near extinction of the species, but the prize was the right to fail on their own terms. General Vance sat in the ruins of Sector 7, the cold desert wind finally blowing through the shattered tunnels. The embryo was gone, leaving only a scorched circle on the floor. He knew this wasn't the end. The Watchers were still out there, hiding in the micro-niche shadows of the stars, waiting for the next civilization to grow ripe for the harvest. But for now, the Eldermurk had receded. The story of the Cold War, the secret files, and the alien gods would become a myth, a warning whispered to future generations: beware the gift of perfection, for it is the ultimate cage. If you have survived this journey through the Eldermurk, you now hold the keys to the most classified secrets of our era. The shadows are long, but the truth is longer. This story may have reached its conclusion, but the files are never truly buried. If you crave more deep dives into the hidden history of our world, the military strategies that define our future, and the cosmic mysteries that watch us from the dark, make sure to subscribe to Eldermurk. Join our ranks, hit the notification bell so you never miss a breach in reality, and leave a comment below. What would you sacrifice for the cost of success? Stay vigilant. The Watchers are always listening.